The sun had not yet cleared the ridge when Ralph Collier rode into Caldwell, Kansas, and the dust his horse kicked up was still swirling in the cold morning air as he swung down from the saddle and tied the reins to the post outside the sheriff's office with a knot that said he was not planning to stay long enough to make it neat. His jaw was set hard. His eyes, dark and weathered from years of sky and wind and grief, were fixed on the door of the building across the street, the stage depot, where Augusta Bishop had been told just 3 days ago that the man she had trusted with everything, the man she had given up her life in St. Louis to follow west, was dead, gone, buried out on the plain in an unmarked grave, the victim of a cattle raid that had never happened. He had the letters in his coat pocket. He had the deed. He had the sworn testimony of 2 witnesses who had seen Clarence Holt alive and drunk and laughing in Wichita not 48 hours after Augusta had been handed a forged death certificate and told to go back east or find herself a new arrangement. He had the evidence, every piece of it, and the fury riding inside him was something that had been building for 3 weeks, since he had first ridden out to the Holt ranch and found it locked tight and Augusta's wagon gone, and one of his own ranch hands, old Pete Dawson, sitting on a fence post with his hat in his hands looking like a man who had witnessed a hanging. Augusta Bishop did not know any of this. She was inside the stage depot right now, and the stage to Kansas City was due at 8 o'clock, and it was currently 7:15, and Ralph Collier had ridden through the night on a horse that deserved a week of rest, and he was not going to let that stage take her anywhere until she heard what he had to say. He pushed through the door of the stage depot, and the bell above it jangled, and the warmth of the wood stove inside hit him like a fist, and then he saw her. She was sitting on a bench along the wall with a single trunk at her feet, and her hands folded in her lap, and her face composed into an expression of dignity that cost her everything to maintain. Augusta Bishop was 28 years old, and she was beautiful in the way that women who have survived difficult things are beautiful, with a kind of bone-deep steadiness to her features, and eyes the color of deep river water and dark hair that she kept pinned, with a precision that suggested she was holding the rest of herself together by the same discipline. She was wearing a dark gray traveling dress that was slightly too thin for the November morning, and she had not looked up when the door opened. Ralph stopped just inside the threshold, and the depot clerk looked up from his counter and then looked back down, deciding this was not his affair. "Augusta," Ralph said. She looked up. And for one single second before the composure reassembled itself like armor clicking into place, he saw what was underneath it, the devastation, the exhaustion, the particular hollow look of a person who has been deceived so thoroughly that they have stopped trusting their own perception of reality. "Ralph," she said, her voice was level, her hands did not move in her lap. "Someone lied to you," he said, "and I have the evidence." The silence in that depot was absolute. The clerk pretended to be fascinated by his ledger. The wood stove ticked. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then stopped. Augusta Bishop did not move for a very long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Sit down and tell me everything." Ralph Collier pulled off his hat and sat down across from her and placed the letters on the bench between them. And the story that unfolded in that cold Kansas morning was one that had its roots in decisions made 4 months earlier, back when Augusta Bishop had first arrived in Caldwell with hope in her heart and absolutely no idea of the trap that had been set for her. She had come west in July of 1882, when the Kansas summer was at its most merciless, and the prairie grasses had gone the color of old hay, and the sky over the plains was so vast and so blue it made people from the east feel exposed in a way they had never felt before, as if the land itself was reading their intentions. Augusta had come from St. Louis, where she had worked for 4 years as a schoolteacher in a district that paid her $40 a month and considered itself generous. She had saved carefully. She had read every book about the West that the St. Louis Public Library owned. She had corresponded by letter for 11 months with a man named Clarence Holt, who had presented himself as a prosperous cattle rancher in the territory south of Caldwell, a man of 35 years with 1,200 acres and a herd of good Texas longhorns, and a house that needed a woman's presence to feel like a home. The letters from Clarence Holt had been well-written and attentive. He had asked about her work, her family, her preferences in music and in literature. He had told her about the ranch in terms that painted it as a place of beauty and hard-won dignity. He had not proposed marriage until the 10th letter, and then he had done it with a formality and a care that Augusta had found deeply respectful. She had accepted. What Augusta had not known, and what would not become clear until the trap had already closed around her, was that the letters she received were not entirely the product of Clarence Holt's own mind. Holt was a real man, and the ranch was real enough, but the ranch was not prosperous. It was indebted. The bank in Caldwell held a mortgage that Holt had been struggling to service for 2 years, and Holt himself was a man of considerable charm but uncertain character, given to gambling, and to the kind of drinking that men in that period and place called sociable, but that his employees called concerning. He had answered the advertisement that a matchmaking agency in St. Louis had placed in various Eastern newspapers, because he had calculated that a wife with savings and a teacher's steady employment history would improve his credit standing and give the bank something more to consider before it foreclosed. The calculation was cold and specific and entirely hidden from Augusta Bishop. She had arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July, stepping off the southbound stage with her single trunk and the particular bright-eyed alertness of a woman who has prepared herself thoroughly and is determined to meet what comes with grace. She had asked directions to the Holt ranch at the stage depot and had been met, instead, by one of Holt's hands, a young man named Carter who had driven a wagon in to collect her. The drive out to the Holt property had taken 2 hours south of town on a rutted track through grassland that was magnificent in its scale and deeply unnerving in its emptiness. And Augusta had spent those 2 hours in conversation with Carter, who was 17 years old and too young to dissemble well, and who had told her, in the disjointed way of someone who does not know they are providing critical information, that the ranch had been having a hard year, that the spring roundup had been disappointing, that Mr. Holt had been in Wichita a lot lately on business. Augusta had filed all of this away in the careful mental ledger she kept on every significant situation and had said nothing that revealed her concern. The ranch house itself was less than the letters had implied. It was functional rather than comfortable, a 2-story structure of unpainted board and batten that had the look of a building started with ambition and finished with exhaustion. The kitchen was adequate. The upstairs rooms were spare. The view from the front porch was extraordinary, that great flat expanse of Kansas prairie rolling away to a horizon so distant, it seemed philosophical rather than geographical. Clarence Holt himself had come out to meet her, and he was, she had to admit to herself, physically impressive. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that had been handsome in his youth and was now merely striking, and he had the kind of easy manner that read as confidence until you had been around it long enough to recognize that it was performance. He had shaken her hand and smiled and said he was glad she had come, and she had looked at him carefully and thought, this will require work, and she had told herself that most things worth having did. The first weeks had been a period of careful observation on Augusta's part and careful management on Holt's. He was attentive in the way that a man is attentive when he is trying to maintain a specific impression, which is to say attentive to the surface of things and inattentive to anything below it. He showed her the cattle and explained his plans for expansion with an enthusiasm that she noted did not quite match the evidence of the actual operation. He introduced her to the neighbors at church in Caldwell on Sundays, where she shook hands and answered questions about St. Louis and learned the geography of the social world around the ranch. It was at church that she first met Ralph Collier. He was standing outside the small white frame building on a Sunday morning in early August, talking to the minister with the posture of a man who would rather be somewhere else, but considers the obligation worth honoring. He was tall in the way that men who work outdoors their whole lives are tall, not particularly imposing in any individual measurement, but occupying space with a completeness that drew the eye. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, with a face that was deeply tanned and lined around the eyes from squinting into sun and wind, and dark hair going gray at the temples, and hands that told the whole story of his occupation without needing any other introduction. He had turned when Holt brought Augusta over to introduce her, and he had looked at her with a directness that was not rude but was absolutely not performative, and he had said, "Miss Bishop, welcome to Kansas," and shaken her hand with a grip that was calibrated carefully, firm without being crushing, and she had thought that here was a man who had learned the full weight of his own strength and was always careful about it. Ralph Collier ran the Collier Ranch, which lay 6 miles east of the Holt property, and was by any observable measure a more successfully managed operation. He had been in Caldwell for 8 years, having come from Texas in 1874 with a small stake and the kind of ferocious industry that either broke a man or built something lasting. He had built something lasting. 1,500 acres, a herd of 650 head of good cattle, a bunkhouse that his men actually wanted to stay in, and a reputation in the county for absolute reliability in business dealings, and for a temper that rarely surfaced but when it did, made sensible men step back. He had been married once, to a woman named Helen who had died in the winter of 1879 of pneumonia, and the grief of that had changed him in ways that he did not talk about, and that showed only in the very specific silence he maintained around certain subjects. He had not seriously considered another attachment since then, not because he had given up on the idea of love, but because the work of the ranch had filled most of the available space in his daily life, and because the women he had met in Caldwell were either already spoken for or were looking for something that he was not at all sure he could offer. He had noticed Augusta Bishop at that first church meeting the way you notice something that is fundamentally different from its surroundings, not obtrusively different, but different in a way that your eye returns to without your permission. She was intelligent. He could see it in the way she listened, in the way she looked at things rather than just seeing them, in the precision of her questions when she asked about the area. She was also clearly doing a careful assessment of her situation that she was keeping entirely private, and he respected that more than he could easily explain. He had said very little to her beyond the pleasantries that the introduction required. She was Clarence Holt's intended, and Ralph Collier did not do things that violated the basic codes of the place and time and community he lived in. But he watched, not in any way that was improper, just with the quiet attentiveness of a man who has learned that paying close attention to what is actually happening, rather than what people say is happening, is the skill that most determines outcomes in a difficult world. What he saw in those first weeks troubled him. He saw Holt's ranch hand, Carter, driving into town more often than ranch business required. He saw the way Holt's manner shifted when certain subjects came up, the way a practiced liar's manner does shift, not with guilt exactly but with a slight recalibration of the surface. He had done business with Holt twice over the years and had found him to be a man who told you what served him and left out what did not, which in business dealings he had simply accounted for with appropriate caution, but which now, with Augusta Bishop's future connected to the man, seemed a more serious characteristic. In late August, about 6 weeks after Augusta had arrived, Ralph had a conversation that changed everything. He had ridden into Caldwell on a Wednesday to conduct business at the bank and the feed merchant, and on his way back, he had stopped at the Caldwell saloon not for drinking but because Tom Reeves, who ran the saloon and was one of the more reliable sources of information about everything that moved through the county, had sent him a message asking him to stop by. Tom Reeves was a tall, lean man with a long face and the eyes of a man who had seen most of what human beings were capable of, and had arrived at a position of charitable acceptance about it. And he poured Ralph a cup of coffee rather than a drink and set it on the bar and leaned on the counter. "You know about the mortgage on the Holt place," Tom said. "I know there is one," Ralph said. "I didn't know the particulars." "Second notice from the bank last month," Tom said. "He's behind on payments, has been for a year. Bank is patient, but it won't be patient forever." Ralph looked at his coffee. "The schoolteacher he's brought out from St. Louis," Tom continued. "She have money of her own." "I have no idea," Ralph said, though his stomach had already tightened. "Carter told Maddox's boy that she brought savings with her," Tom said. "Significant savings. Apparently Holt's been telling the boys at the bunkhouse that he expects things to improve considerably now." Ralph put down his coffee cup. "He tell her any of this?" Ralph asked. Tom Reeves looked at him with the expression of a man who already knows the answer to a question he is declining to speak aloud. Ralph rode back to his ranch that evening with the kind of quiet fury that he did not let show on his face and did not talk about with anyone, because the fury was still in the stage where it was looking for evidence rather than an outlet. He was a man who did not act on suspicion. He required facts. He got his facts over the next 3 weeks in pieces. He found out from the bank's clerk, a young man named Whitfield who respected Ralph, and told him what he could without violating his professional obligation, that the Holt mortgage was indeed seriously delinquent, and that negotiations were in progress. He found out from the county recorder's office, where public documents were public, that Holt had filed amended paperwork on his property ownership in the past month that appeared designed to complicate any future legal proceedings. He found out from a cattle buyer named Sorensen, who had done business with both of them, that Holt had told him at the Wichita stockyards in July that he expected to be in a position to expand significantly by the fall because of a personal matter that was coming together well. He had the shape of the betrayal now. He did not yet have the direct proof. He also had the growing, privately agonizing awareness that Augusta Bishop herself was conducting her own quiet assessment, and that she was finding some of the same things he was finding. He could see it in the way she was at Sunday church meetings, the careful, contained quality of her attention, the slight withdrawal that was imperceptible to someone who was not looking for it. He began to take every opportunity that decency allowed to be in proximity to her, not to court her, because she was in Holt's orbit and he would not do that, but to be available to her as a reliable presence, a known quantity in a landscape that was becoming less certain to her by the week. It was on a Sunday in early September that they had their first real conversation, meaning a conversation that went beneath the social surface and became something else. The congregation had dispersed after services and Holt had gone to talk to a man about a horse, which Augusta seemed neither surprised by nor particularly concerned about. And Ralph had found himself standing near her at the corner of the churchyard fence, where there was a good view of the prairie to the west, and he had said something about the light at that hour, which was the particular clear light of a September morning in Kansas when the air is still cool and the grasses are just beginning to turn. And she had said, "It's the most honest light I've seen in a long time." He had looked at her. She had not looked back at him, but there was something deliberate in the statement that he recognized as an invitation to respond honestly. "Kansas doesn't have much patience for pretending things are different than they are," he said. "I've noticed that," she said, a pause. The wind moved through the dry grass beyond the fence. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 8 years, he said. "Do you find it's changed you?" He thought about Helen, about the winters, about the particular education that only difficulty can provide. "Yes," he said, "for the better, I think, though it's hard to be objective about your own changes." She turned and looked at him then directly with those deep river water eyes, and he kept his face steady and returned the look without calculation or performance, just looked at her honestly, and something passed between them that neither of them named because neither of them was in a position to name it. "I think I'm going to like Kansas," she said, "if I can get to know the real version of it." He had understood exactly what she meant. Over the next several weeks they had conversations at church and twice in town when their business happened to coincide, and each conversation went a little deeper than the last. And Ralph Collier found himself in the very specific predicament of a man who is falling in love with a woman he is not permitted to pursue, which is a predicament that has existed as long as human beings have had social rules, and which never becomes less painful for being common. He was not going to act on it. That was simply not who he was, but he could not be dishonest with himself about what it was. She was remarkable. She was precisely the kind of person he had stopped believing he would find in Caldwell, and she had arrived attached to a man he was increasingly convinced was in the process of using her as a financial instrument. The question that kept him awake was not whether he had feelings for her. The question was what his obligation was as a decent man in a situation where someone was being deceived, and he had partial but not complete knowledge of the deception. He decided to get the complete knowledge. He rode to Wichita in the first week of October on the pretext of cattle business, and he spent 3 days there, conducting his actual cattle business as efficiently as he could, and devoting the remainder of his time to a careful inquiry into Clarence Holt's activities in that city over the past year. What he found in Wichita was worse than he had expected. Holt had a second arrangement in Wichita. A woman named Vera Hutchins, who ran a small boarding house on Chestnut Street, who had been receiving regular if irregular visits from Holt for most of the past year, and who, when Ralph spoke to her neighbor under the pretext of looking for a room, was understood in that neighborhood to be waiting for a proposal that Holt had apparently been promising, was forthcoming once he got his business affairs in order. Ralph stood in the Wichita Street outside that boarding house and thought about Augusta Bishop sitting on that ranch south of Caldwell with her savings and her intelligence and her carefully maintained composure and her absolute unawareness of any of this. And the fury that moved through him was clean and cold and very focused. He had more business to do in Wichita. He went to the county courthouse and examined the land records and found the transfer documents that Holt had filed, transferring a significant portion of his ranch's assessed assets into a separate holding that was structured in a way that would shelter them from creditor claims, but that required, in its original filing, a co-signature that could only be a recently arrived wife with independent assets. Augusta had not signed anything of the kind. Not yet. The space for her signature was blank. But the document existed, and the intent was clear. He went to the bank in Wichita where he knew Holt had done business, and spoke to an officer there who confirmed, with the careful neutrality of a man protecting his institution's interests, that certain conversations had taken place about refinancing arrangements that would require additional collateral or a new investor. Then Ralph Collier went back to his hotel room and sat at the small desk by the window and spread out everything he had gathered and looked at it all together, and saw the full shape of the trap that had been set for Augusta Bishop. Holt had recruited her through the matchmaking agency as a deliberate financial strategy. He had used the courtship to create a genuine emotional investment on her part. He had brought her west with every intention of marrying her for access to her savings and her creditworthiness, using her as a means to stabilize his failing ranch and potentially to fund an expansion that would improve his standing. He had no intention of providing her with the honest partnership the letters had promised. And there was the woman in Wichita who constituted not just a betrayal of Augusta's trust, but a specific plan that Holt seemed to be keeping warm against future developments. Ralph wrote down everything he had in order. He collected every document he could legally obtain. He obtained statements from 2 individuals in Wichita who had seen and heard things that bore on the situation, including a man named Griggs who worked at the stockyards, and who had been present at a conversation where Holt had discussed his financial strategy with a frankness that he would not have permitted in anyone he expected to report it. He rode back to Caldwell with everything, and he spent a week deciding what to do with it. This was the hardest week. because what he had was evidence of a betrayal that Augusta did not yet know about, and the question of how to deliver that information and to what end and with what right was not simple. He had no formal relationship with her. He had no sanctioned role in her life. He could not simply present himself at the Holt Ranch and say the things he needed to say without that act itself constituting a violation of the social codes that gave community life its stability. He asked himself, with the rigorous honesty he applied to every serious question, whether his desire to tell her was purely on her behalf, or whether some part of it was on his own behalf, an attempt to clear the field for his own interests. And he sat with that question long enough and honestly enough to arrive at an answer he trusted. It was both, and the fact that it was both did not make the information less true or less important for her to have. A man could care about a woman and also care about her interests. Those things were not in conflict. He decided he would find a way to tell her. He never got the chance. Before he could arrange it, in the first week of November, Clarence Holt had a visit from the bank in Caldwell, and the result of that visit was a timetable that accelerated everything. 2 days after the bank's visit, Holt rode into town and sent a telegram that Ralph only later discovered was to the matchmaking agency in St. Louis, asking them to inquire about the status of Augusta's assets and whether they had been transferred as discussed. That same evening, something happened at the Holt Ranch that no one entirely understood at the time, but that had the quality of a confrontation, because Augusta Bishop had not been entirely in the dark about everything. She had been finding pieces herself, as Ralph had known she would, because she was not a woman who stopped looking at what was actually in front of her. She had found a letter in Holt's desk, not snooping exactly but looking for paper to write a letter home, and the letter was from Vera Hutchins in Wichita, and its contents were unmistakable. The confrontation that followed was apparently significant. Ralph heard about it later from Carter, who heard it from another hand, in the fragmentary way that information moves through a small rural community. What was clear was that Holt, faced with direct questions, had chosen a strategy that was as cold as anything he had done before. He had denied everything with a composure that suggested long practice, and when Augusta had pressed him, he had shifted into a counterattack that was designed to destabilize her confidence in her own perceptions. He had told her that Vera Hutchins was a cousin. He had told her she was misreading things because she was anxious about the transition to Western life. He had been just sufficiently plausible, just sufficiently calm, just sufficiently aware of the small vulnerabilities that someone who has left everything behind and traveled to an unknown place will carry, to create doubt in her where there had been certainty. And Augusta Bishop, who was strong but who had been alone in that uncertainty for months with no independent source of information, had retreated from certainty into a painful, confused middle ground. It was in this state, 2 days later, that the final blow had been struck. A man had come to the ranch on a Saturday morning, and he had come with official-looking documents and had told Augusta that Clarence Holt had been involved in an incident on the trail north of Wichita, a cattle altercation involving rustlers, and that he had been killed. The documents looked real. There was a death certificate with a clerk's stamp on it. There was a letter from a county official. There was a witness statement. Every piece of it was forged. Augusta Bishop had received this information with the specific kind of shock that does not express itself in tears or dramatic physical reaction, but instead creates a sudden and complete silence in the body, as though everything that was previously vibrating has stopped. She had sat down. She had thanked the man. She had asked practical questions in a voice that was steady through an act of will so enormous that it should have been visible. Then she had made a decision in that same terrible stillness. She would go back east. There was nothing for her here. The man she had come to was dead, or so she believed, and even before his supposed death the truth about him had been corroding the ground she stood on, and there was nothing left to stand on. She had packed her trunk. She had paid the last of the ranch hands what they were owed from her own money, because no one else was doing it and it was the right thing to do. She had arranged a ride to Caldwell with Carter, who drove her in the ranch wagon with a silence that she read as respect, and that was actually guilt, because Carter knew more than he had told her and was too young and too frightened to know what to do with that knowledge. She had gone to the stage depot and booked passage on the Kansas City stage for Monday morning, which was 2 days away. She had spent the weekend in the small hotel on Main Street in Caldwell, and she had done it with her composure intact, and her practical decisions made, and the grief and the rage and the humiliation and the profound loneliness folded down inside her so tightly that they took up almost no space at all. That was where she was when Ralph Collier had ridden through the night to reach her. Now she sat across from him in the stage depot with the letters spread between them on the bench and the wood stove ticking in the corner, and the morning light coming through the single window, and she read every word of every document he had brought. She read slowly and completely, the way she had always read, without skimming, understanding that the details mattered. She read the witness statement from Griggs at the Wichita stockyards. She read the letter from the county recorder detailing the filing of the asset protection document. She read the confirmation from the Wichita bank officer. She read the 2-page sworn account that Ralph had obtained from Vera Hutchins herself, who had discovered in the past week that Holt had been telling her the same calibrated falsehoods he had been telling Augusta, and who was, consequently, in a state of cold fury that made her cooperative. Vera Hutchins was not a villain in this story. She was another woman who had been deceived by the same man, and the parallel of their situations was not lost on either Augusta, reading the account, or on Ralph, watching her read it. Augusta finished reading. She sat for a moment with the last document in her lap and her eyes not on it but on the middle distance. "He is not dead," she said. It was not a question. "No," Ralph said. "He is in Wichita. I have reason to believe he intended the death certificate to accomplish 2 things. First, to remove you as a legal complication without having to actually end the engagement formally, which would have created obligations. Second, to allow him to claim, if the property arrangement was ever examined, that his wife-to-be had left voluntarily before the arrangement was completed." "He needed me to leave before I could sign anything," Augusta said. "Or before you could refuse to sign anything," Ralph said. "You had begun to ask questions. He needed to move you off the board." Augusta looked at the letters again. She picked up the forged death certificate that Ralph had obtained from someone who had seen it before it was delivered and had made a copy of the official-looking format. "This is well done," she said quietly. "Someone helped him create this." "A man in Wichita who makes documents," Ralph said. "I know who he is. The sheriff needs to know about all of this." Augusta set down the death certificate with the precise, controlled movement of a woman who is managing something large and dangerous inside herself. "You rode through the night," she said. "Yes, to stop me from leaving. To make sure you had the truth before you made a decision," he said carefully. "What you do with the truth is your own affair." She looked at him directly then, with that full, undivided attention that was one of the first things he had noticed about her, the quality of her gaze when she was actually looking at you rather than at the social surface of a situation. "Why?" she asked. The question was completely simple and completely serious. He held her gaze and told her the truth, because he was not a man who had the capacity to do otherwise when someone asked him something that directly. "'Cause you came west with your whole life in a trunk and a promise that was a lie, and you have been alone in that for months, and the decent thing is for someone to stand beside you and make sure you have what you need to make a real choice." He paused. "And because I have watched you for 3 months and you are the most honest person in this county and you deserve better than what you were given." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. "You have been watching me," she said, not accusatory, simply precise. "Paying attention," he said. "There is a difference." Something moved in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. "I have been paying attention to you as well," she said. He did not respond to that directly because the situation still required doing the practical work before anything else could be considered. "The stage," he said. "We need to decide what you want to do." "I want to speak to the sheriff," she said, "and I want Clarence Holt to face what he did." "I can help with that," Ralph said. "I suspect you can," she said. "You seem to have been helping with it already." They went to the sheriff's office together, Augusta with her evidence and Ralph with his. And the sheriff, a methodical man named Bales who had seen most kinds of trouble and dealt with all of them the same way, with careful documentation and zero tolerance for drama, received their account with professional attention and spent 45 minutes going through the documents. At the end of that time, he looked up and told them that what they had described was mail fraud, forgery, and potentially conspiracy, all of which were federal offenses as well as territorial ones, and that he would be sending a telegram to Wichita within the hour. It took 4 days for the Wichita authorities to locate Clarence Holt. During those 4 days, Augusta Bishop stayed at the Caldwell Hotel, which she could afford because she had been careful with her savings and had not allowed any of them to be touched by Holt's various implied suggestions about investment in the ranch. She spent those days in a state of controlled waiting, which was its own kind of test. Ralph Collier rode back to his ranch after the meeting with the sheriff and attempted to return to the ordinary business of running a cattle operation in November, which involved feeding and checking on a herd that had been moved to the winter pastures, and managing the bunkhouse, and dealing with a fencing dispute with a neighbor to the south that had been smoldering for 2 months. He did all of this with his usual efficiency, and with a portion of his mind perpetually occupied elsewhere. He rode into Caldwell on the second day, on what he told himself was business. Augusta was in the hotel's small sitting room reading when he came in, and she looked up and set down her book and said, "Sheriff Bales had word from Wichita this morning. They found him." "Is he in custody?" Ralph asked. "They are processing the paperwork," she said. "He will be brought back to Caldwell to face the fraud charges here. Sheriff Bales says the forgery alone is sufficient." Ralph sat down in the chair across from her and looked at her and found nothing particularly comfortable to say about the situation, so he did not say anything comfortable. He said, "How are you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am better than I was 4 days ago," she said. "I was very low 4 days ago. I was not certain of my own judgment, and that is a very specific kind of misery." "Your judgment was not wrong," he said. "He was very deliberate about creating uncertainty in you. That is a different thing from your judgment being unreliable." "Yes," she said. "I know that now. Knowing it intellectually is one thing. Feeling certain of it in your own bones is another thing entirely." She looked at him steadily. "You could not have arranged for someone to tell me sooner." It was not quite an accusation. It was a real question. "I was trying to find a way to do it that would not do more damage than good," he said. "You were in his household. I had no standing. If I had come to you with suspicions and no evidence, or if I had approached you in any way that looked like what it was, which was a man with an interest in you trying to remove a rival, you would have been right to question my motives." She was quiet for a moment. "You are right," she said. "I would have questioned your motives. I would have been wrong to dismiss them on that basis, but I probably would have, because I was also trying to trust the situation I had committed to. I moved as fast as I could while doing it properly," he said. "I believe you," she said. And then, after a pause, "That is not nothing, believing someone." They sat in that sitting room for another hour, and talked about things that ranged from the practical to the personal, moving back and forth between them in the way of a conversation between two people who are discovering the dimensions of each other. She told him about St. Louis and the school, and the 4 years of teaching, and what it was like to be 28 in 1882, and to have taken your life seriously as your own project rather than as something that would be completed by attachment to someone else. He told her about Texas and the years of building the ranch, and about Helen, briefly but honestly, because she deserved to know the full geography of who he was, and grief was part of it. She listened to the part about Helen the way she listened to everything, completely and without filling the space with noise. "I'm sorry," she said when he had finished. That is a terrible thing to lose. It was, he said. It made me more careful about what was real and what I was telling myself was real, both in myself and in others. She nodded slowly. Is that what you were doing with me? She asked. Being careful about what was real. Yes, he said. I am still being careful. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read, but that was not unfriendly. So am I, she said. Clarence Holt was brought to Caldwell in the second week of November, under the custody of a Wichita deputy, and the formal legal proceedings began with the specific grinding slowness of territorial justice, which was thorough if not swift. Ralph provided his testimony. Augusta provided hers, sitting in the courthouse with her back straight and her voice steady, and telling the truth in a sequence so clear and organized that the county judge commented afterward to Ralph that in 30 years on the bench, he had rarely heard a more useful witness account. Holt, for his part, maintained his composure through the early proceedings with a stubbornness that suggested he had not yet accepted that the ground had entirely shifted. Then the Wichita documents were presented. Then Vera Hutchins's sworn statement was read into the record. Then the forged death certificate was examined by a documents expert from Topeka who gave his opinion in terms that left no reasonable doubt about its manufactured nature. Holt was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of forgery in December of 1882, and sentenced to 4 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing. The ranch, examined in the full light of legal scrutiny, turned out to have liabilities that substantially exceeded its assets, and the bank foreclosed on the property without sentiment. The day after the sentencing, Ralph found Augusta outside the courthouse in the cold December air, standing still and looking at the street with an expression that he recognized as the particular emptiness that follows a long tension when it finally releases. "Is it finished enough?" he asked. "It is finished," she said. "I feel strange. I expected to feel better than this, and instead I feel empty." "That is what happens when something you have been fighting against is gone," he said. "The space it occupied does not fill immediately." She turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" "I felt the same way when Helen died," he said. "I had been fighting for a year to save her, every remedy anyone suggested, everything I could find or afford or imagine, and when she was gone I felt nothing for a while except the absence of the fight. It was worse in some ways than the grief." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. "I don't want to go back to St. Louis," she said quietly. His heart moved in his chest with a precision that he felt in his hands. "You don't have to," he said. "I came west because I believed in it," she said. "Not just in the specific arrangement I came to. I believed there was something real here, something that would require the best of what I had and give me something honest in return." "There is," he said. "I know," she said, and she looked at him in a way that made clear she was not talking only about the landscape. He was careful, he was very careful, he did not rush anything. He was 36 years old and she was 28, and they were both people who had been shaped by experiences that made them deliberate rather than impulsive. And the care they brought to what was growing between them was itself a kind of testament to how seriously they were both taking it. He asked 2 days after the sentencing if she would like to see the Collier ranch. He framed it as a practical matter. The hotel was not a long-term solution, and he had a contact who might know of a teaching position in the county school, but the school board chairman lived near his property, and it would be logical to visit while making that inquiry. Augusta, who was fully aware that the school board inquiry was real but was not the primary purpose of the visit, said yes. The ride out to the Collier ranch on a December morning was different from her first trip to the Holt property, in ways that she could not entirely quantify but felt in her body as unmistakably. The sky was the same vast Kansas sky, but the track was better maintained, and the destination had a quality that she could sense even before it came into view over the last low rise, the quality of a place that was genuinely cared for. The house was substantial, a main building of good timber with a full porch across the front and outbuildings that were well placed and well built. a bunkhouse at a reasonable distance, a large barn with a sound roof, corrals that were carefully maintained. The whole property had the look of a man's vision that had been consistently applied over a long period, not grand but real, every element functional and properly executed. She stood on the porch and looked out at the prairie and felt something settle in her. "This is what I imagine," she said. He stood beside her, a careful distance that respected everything that was still unresolved between them, and said nothing for a moment. "It's taken 8 years," he said. "It still isn't finished. There are things I want to add: fencing on the eastern pasture, a larger root cellar, eventually another room on the north side of the house." She looked at him. "Another room." "The house has only 2 bedrooms currently," he said, very carefully, looking at the prairie rather than at her. "I have thought for some time that it should have more." The pause that followed had the specific warmth of something unspoken that is fully understood by both parties. "I would like to see the school," Augusta said, stepping carefully back into the practical dimension of the visit without either of them being awkward about it. They visited the school board chairman, a pleasant man named Hartwell, who was delighted at the prospect of a qualified teacher from the East, and who outlined the county's needs with the enthusiasm of someone who had been managing with an inadequate situation for too long. The salary was lower than St. Louis, but the cost of living in Caldwell was correspondingly different. The school was a single-room structure on the edge of town that served 32 children ranging from 6 to 15 years of age. The previous teacher had left in October to be married. Augusta accepted the position before she had consciously decided to. She began teaching in January of 1883, and teaching was the thing that anchored her to Caldwell and to this particular chapter of her life in a way that nothing else could have, because teaching was the thing she was best at, and the thing she loved most, and the thing that gave her days a structure and a purpose that felt entirely her own. The children of Caldwell and its surrounding ranches were mostly good-hearted, universally curious, and in various degrees of readiness for what she had to offer them. She gave them everything she had. She and Ralph moved through the winter in a series of careful, honest steps toward each other. He came to Sunday church and sat in the same general area, and they walked home in the same direction and talked. He came to the school once with a donation of supplies that he had put together without making it a large gesture, just paper and pencils, and a new reader text that Hartwell had mentioned needing. She thanked him with the specific quality of warmth that she reserved for things that were genuinely moving, and that she was trying not to let be too obvious. He invited her to dinner at the ranch on a Sunday in February, a proper dinner with his longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Almgren, present to observe all the appropriate proprieties, and Augusta came, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate elk stew and cornbread, and talked for 3 hours about everything from the political situation in Washington to the philosophy of education to the specific challenges of running a cattle operation through a Kansas winter. And when he rode her back to town in the wagon, he said, "I would like to do this again." "Next Sunday," she said. "Or before," he said. She smiled in the dark of the wagon with the cold air around them and said, "Wednesday." The courtship that followed was unhurried and entirely mutual, and had a quality that both of them privately noted was unlike anything they had experienced before, not because it was without difficulty or uncertainty, but because it was without performance. Neither of them was pretending to be simpler or less complicated or more immediately certain than they were. They were two careful, observant, somewhat guarded people who had both been shaped by loss and by the specific education of taking their own lives seriously, and they were falling in love with a depth and a completeness that was directly proportional to that carefulness. He told her in late February on one of their Wednesday evenings at the ranch that he loved her. He said it plainly and without drama, looking at her across the kitchen table in the light of the oil lamp, and she looked at him for a long moment with that full, attentive gaze. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." A pause. "I love you too, Ralph. I have been trying to be sure that it was real and not relief or gratitude, and I am sure. I know the difference, he said. I have been watching you closely enough to know the difference. She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And in that simple act in that lamplight kitchen on a Kansas winter evening, something was settled between them that had been in motion since August. He asked her to marry him in March of 1883, on a Sunday afternoon when they had ridden out to the eastern edge of his property to look at the pastures, and the day was one of those early spring days in Kansas when the air still has winter in it, but the light has changed, and there is the first smell of new grass coming up through the dead, and the prairie stretched away in every direction with that immensity that had stopped feeling threatening to her and started feeling like what she had always wanted. The real and unmediated truth of the world. He stopped his horse and she stopped hers, and he looked at her in the spring light and said, "Augusta, I would like to spend the rest of my life with you, and I want to say that knowing everything it means, the work and the winters and the distance from everything you came from and the building of something that will take years, I am asking you with full knowledge of what I have and what I don't have and with no pretending about either. Will you marry me?" She sat on her horse in the Kansas spring and felt the wind and looked at him and knew this was the most real thing she had been offered in her life. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ralph, I will marry you." He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, for the first time, in the open air of the spring prairie with the wind moving around them. And it was the kind of kiss that people who have been very careful for a very long time give when they finally allow themselves to stop being careful, which is to say it was thorough and serious and deeply, undeniably real. They were married in May of 1883 in the same small white church in Caldwell where they had first met, with the congregation of the community around them. Mrs. Almgren cried in the front pew. Tom Reeves from the saloon, who had come as a witness and a well-wisher, stood in the back with his hat in his hands and nodded with the expression of a man whose sense of justice is satisfied. Hartwell from the school board sat with his wife and beamed. Carter, Holt's former ranch hand who had since found work at a neighboring property and had spent several months dealing with the guilt of knowing more than he had said, came and stood at the back and left quickly but came. Augusta wore a dress she had made herself over the previous 2 months, a deep blue that was the right color for her, and that she had ordered the fabric for from a Topeka catalog, and she walked down the aisle of that little church with her head up and her eyes on Ralph Collier, and felt more completely herself than she had felt at any moment in her adult life. He was standing at the front in a good dark coat that he had purchased in Caldwell, and that Mrs. Almgren had pressed, and he was looking at her with an expression that he had not bothered to arrange into anything socially appropriate, just the unguarded, complete look of a man seeing exactly what he has been looking for without knowing it, and she felt that look arrive in her chest like something coming home. The minister read the vows and they said them to each other, looking at each other, and the words had the specific weight of words that both parties intend completely. They moved Augusta's things to the ranch the following week. The school year ended in June, and she would resume in September, which gave them a summer to establish the particular rhythms of the shared life they were beginning. The summer of 1883 on the Collier Ranch was the kind of summer that people refer to in the language of memory as though it exists slightly outside time, not because nothing difficult happened. Cattle ranching in Kansas was a business made entirely of difficult things, but because they were doing it together and both of them were keenly aware of the specific gift of that. Augusta learned the ranch with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. She learned the cattle, which she found she did not love as such but respected as the serious business they were. She learned the rhythms of the seasons and what they required. She took over the management of the household accounts with a precision that found several areas where money was being spent less efficiently than it could be, small things that added up, and presented her findings to Ralph one evening with the matter-of-fact calm of a woman who expects to be a full partner in everything, not a decorative attachment. He looked at her accounting with genuine admiration and said, "I had no idea about the feed merchant overcharge. That's been going on for 2 years." "I know," she said. "I found the pattern in the invoices." "You found a pattern in invoices from a feed merchant," he said, looking at her with an expression that was simultaneously amused and entirely serious. "I spent 4 years managing a school district's supplies budget," she said. "Feed invoices are not so different." He shook his head slowly with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when she did something that delighted him, but that he was not certain how to express without making it sound insufficient. "What?" she said. "I am thinking that I am an extremely fortunate man," he said. She felt the warmth of it move through her. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "You are." The fall came and she went back to teaching, and the school year filled her days with purpose and her evenings with the particular contentment of someone who has work that matters and a home to return to. Ralph rode out in October to the fall roundup with his men, and came back sunburned and tired and happy in the physical way of men who have done the work of their lives with their bodies. And she met him at the door and brought him coffee, and he sat down heavily in the kitchen chair and said, "I missed you every day." "I know," she said. "I counted." He looked up at her. "The days," he said. "Yes." He set down his coffee and stood up, despite the tiredness, and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her with the full weight of a man who has been away from something necessary and is now back in its presence. In early December of 1883, Augusta told Ralph that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with the straightforward directness that characterized everything she did with him. She told him, and then she watched his face. What she saw there was something she kept in her memory for the rest of her life. He sat very still for a moment, and then something moved in his expression that was deep and complex and entirely unguarded, joy in something that was very close to awe and the particular tender terror of someone being offered something immense. "Augusta," he said, and his voice was different than she had heard it, quieter and less composed. "Yes," she said simply. He reached across the table and took her face in both his hands very gently and kissed her, with a tenderness that was entirely different from passion, the tenderness of a man who is being careful with something precious. And she put her hands over his, and they stayed like that for a long time in the warm kitchen with the winter outside the windows. Their son was born in August of 1884, a healthy boy with Ralph's dark hair and Augusta's deliberate eyes, who arrived in the world with the vigorous efficiency of someone who has made up his mind. They named him James Henry Collier, James for Augusta's father and Henry for Ralph's, and he was placed in the cradle that Ralph had built over the winter months with a care that had made Mrs. Almgren observe that she had never seen a man spend so much time on a piece of furniture. Parenthood changed them in the ways that parenthood always changes people, and in some ways that were specific to who they were. Augusta brought the same systematic intelligence to raising James that she brought to teaching, which meant she was both thoroughly prepared and entirely willing to be corrected by the reality of an actual infant who did not read the books she had consulted. Ralph brought a gentleness to his son that surprised people who had only known him as a capable, somewhat reserved ranching man, and which did not surprise Augusta at all. James grew into a toddler who had both parents' qualities in interesting combinations: Augusta's precision and Ralph's patience, Augusta's intellectual curiosity and Ralph's physical steadiness, and who had his own quality that was entirely his own, a kind of serene determination that made him very effective with animals, which Ralph noticed when the boy was 3 and began following him to the barn with complete seriousness. The ranch grew through the mid-1880s in the way that well-managed operations grow, steadily and without drama. Ralph added the eastern fencing he had planned. He expanded the herd to 800 head. The additional room on the north side of the house was built in 1885, in anticipation of the family's expansion, which proved well-timed when Augusta became pregnant again in the fall of that year. Their second child, born in June of 1886, was a girl they named Clara Ann Collier, who arrived with opinions she communicated at considerable volume, and who had, by the age of 2, established herself as the most determined individual on the property, which included the cattle. She had Augusta's dark hair and eyes and Ralph's broad, easy smile, and she was adored by everyone including James, who adjusted to her arrival with the equanimity of a boy who had been prepared carefully by 2 adults who believed in honest communication. Augusta continued teaching until Clara was born and then took a year away from the school, which found a replacement teacher for that period. She returned to teaching in the fall of 1887, with Mrs. Almgren's help in the mornings, and Ralph adjusting his schedule to ensure someone was always with the children. The county had grown around them in those years. Caldwell had expanded, with new buildings on Main Street and a larger hotel and a second church, and a newspaper that had begun publication in 1885, and that Augusta read with critical attention and occasionally wrote letters to the editor of, on subjects ranging from the quality of public education to the rights of women to vote in school board elections, which Kansas was one of the few places in the country that permitted. She wrote those letters with Ralph's full encouragement, which she had not taken for granted and had tested carefully before assuming. She had asked him early in their marriage what he thought about her views, specifically the views she held about women's rights to economic independence and civic participation, views that were not universally popular in Kansas in 1883. He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "I think you are right about all of it. I also think that the fact that I think you are right should not be the primary reason you act on what you believe." She had felt the rightness of that statement in her bones. "No," she said, "it should not, but it does matter to me that you think so." "I know," he said, "it matters to me that you think so too." In 1888, 5 years after their marriage, Ralph and Augusta rode out one evening to the eastern edge of the property, which had become something of a habit of theirs, an occasional private ritual of going to the place where she had said yes to him and standing in the prairie light together. James was 7 and Clara was 2, and Mrs. Almgren was with them at the house, and the evening was the particular blue-gold of a Kansas summer evening when the light comes in low and turns the grass to something almost luminescent. They stood in that light without speaking for a while, the way people who know each other deeply well can stand together in silence without it being anything other than companionable. "I have been thinking about something," Ralph said finally. "Tell me," she said. "I want to buy the parcel to the north," he said. "The Maddox land. His sons are not interested in keeping it, and it would expand our water access considerably. But it is a significant investment, and I want to discuss it with you fully before anything is decided." She turned to look at him. "I think it is the right move," she said. "I looked at the water figures last month when I was doing the accounts, and the northern access would change the whole summer management of the South herd." He looked at her. "You were already thinking about it." "I noticed the Maddox boys were not working the property and I did the arithmetic," she said simply. He shook his head slowly. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am just thinking again about how fortunate I am." "You say that rather often," she said. "I mean it every time," he said. She stepped closer to him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the evening light with the prairie stretching out before them, the land that was theirs and that they had built into something real. And she could feel his warmth beside her, and the slight roughness of his coat under her hand, and the absolute solidness of him, not just physically, but in every essential way. And she thought about the woman she had been when she stepped off the stage in Caldwell in July of 1882 with her single trunk and her hope and her absolute unawareness of the trap that was waiting for her. And she thought about everything that had had to go wrong in order for her to end up here, beside this man in this place in this life. "Ralph," she said. "Yes. I am grateful," she said, For everything, including the parts that were terrible. He pulled her closer and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "So am I," he said. "God help me, so am I." The Maddox land purchase went through in the fall of 1888 and expanded the Collier Ranch to nearly 3,000 acres, making it one of the larger operations in the county. Ralph hired 2 additional ranch hands, and Augusta spent a full week revising the account books to accommodate the new scale of the operation, and then presented Ralph with a management plan so organized and comprehensive that he read it twice, and then put it on the desk and said, "I think you should have been running this ranch for years." "I have been running it," she said pleasantly. "Just the parts that everyone could see as well as the parts that only showed up in the accounts." He laughed genuinely, one of those full laughs that changed his whole face. James turned 8 in August of 1892 and showed every sign of being exactly what Ralph had hoped he would be, which was a young man who cared about the land and understood it, with his mother's mind and his father's steady hands. He spent his afternoons after school, when Augusta did not require him for studies, trailing Ralph through the ranch operations with the seriousness of an apprentice who intends to be a master someday. Ralph taught him everything with a patience and a thoroughness that Augusta found deeply moving to observe. Clara, at 6, had decided that she wanted to be a teacher like her mother, a decision she had arrived at with the characteristic firmness of a child who does not try on many ideas, but when she chooses one, chooses it completely. Augusta taught her letters and numbers in the evenings with the particular satisfaction of a teacher who has a student at exactly the right age with exactly the right kind of attention, which Clara had in abundance. In 1893, 10 years after their marriage, Augusta discovered she was expecting again, a surprise that was in equal parts startling and deeply welcome. She was 40 years old and Ralph was 47, and they had both assumed that Clara would be their last child, and the news required some adjustment of assumptions. Ralph's response was characteristic. He did not panic and he did not minimize. He sat with the news for a day and then came to Augusta with a list of practical considerations and a look in his eyes that told her everything he had not put on the list. "I spoke to Dr. Harrison today," he said. "He says that 40 is not what it was 20 years ago in terms of medical understanding, and that he has delivered healthy children to women your age and older, and that with good care the outlook is positive." "I know," Augusta said. "I spoke to him myself." Ralph looked at her. "Of course you did," he said. "I wanted to gather my own information," she said, "without filtering. And I am feeling well and I intend to continue feeling well," she said, with the specific quality of decision in her voice that meant she had made her determination and would not be dissuaded from it. He took her hand. "I know you do," he said. "I just need you to know that nothing else matters to me as much as you." She squeezed his hand and looked at him steadily. "I know that, Ralph. I have known it for 10 years. Their third child was born in the spring of 1894. A healthy boy they named Thomas William Collier, who arrived with the same practical efficiency as James and who had Augusta's lighter complexion, and apparently Ralph's hands, which Dr. Harrison noted were remarkably large for a newborn. Ralph held his third child with the same stunned gentleness he had held his first, and Augusta, watching from the bed with the particular exhaustion and satisfaction of recent childbirth, thought that some men grew larger with their children rather than smaller, that fatherhood added something to Ralph rather than taking from it, and that this was one of the things she loved most about him. The ranch in the summer of 1894 was everything that either of them had imagined and considerably more than what Augusta had hoped for when she had stepped off the stage in Caldwell 12 years earlier. The house had grown with the family and was now a genuinely comfortable home, with a proper parlor and a good kitchen and 4 bedrooms, and a porch that Augusta had filled with a rocking chair and a small table for her evening reading. The land around it was productive and well managed. The cattle operation was reliable. The school in Caldwell was, under Augusta's decade of influence, significantly better than it had been, with a second teacher hired in 1889, and a proper curriculum that reflected Augusta's belief that children deserved access to the full range of knowledge. She had continued to write her letters to the newspaper on the subjects she cared about, and she had been present at every school board meeting for 10 years, and had been elected to the board itself in 1890. In the school board elections, where Kansas women had the right to vote and to stand, and she had served with the thorough, organized effectiveness that everyone who knew her had expected. She had advocated for teachers' salaries and for science education, and for the equal admission of children from the farming families to the west of town, who had sometimes been overlooked in the informal arrangements of previous administrations. She had also, in 1892, been part of a group of women in the county who had written collectively to their state representative about the expansion of women's suffrage beyond school board elections, a letter that had been reported in the Topeka newspaper, and that had generated a volume of correspondence to the Caldwell paper, both supportive and hostile. Ralph had read every published letter and commented on each of them with a precision that showed he had thought about the argument seriously, and had said at the end of reading the last one, "The hostile letters are all essentially the same letter written by different hands." "Yes," she said, "they are afraid of what they would have to change." "They are," he said. "It is coming anyway." "Yes," she said, "it is." One evening in the late summer of 1895, when Thomas was a year old, and James was 13 and Clara was 9, and the light was the long amber light of a Kansas August evening, Augusta sat on the front porch in her rocking chair with Thomas asleep in her arms, the warm weight of a sleeping baby being one of the things she had learned to value with the full appreciation of someone who has not always had it. And Ralph came up the porch steps from the barn and sat down in the chair beside her, and they watched the light move over the prairie. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked over at him. "That morning in November when I rode into town," he said, "I came to the stage depot. I remember," she said. "I rehearsed what I would say for most of the night," he said. "All the different ways of explaining it, the evidence, what it meant, what you needed to know. I had it organized very clearly in my head by the time I reached Caldwell. And then you walked in and said exactly 7 words," she said. He looked at her. "Someone lied to her and I have the evidence," she said, with the quality of a person quoting something they know well. "Yes," he said. "Everything else went right out of my head when I saw you," she smiled. Thomas shifted in her arms, made a small sound, and settled back to sleep. "I am glad you came," she said. "I would have been on that stage otherwise." "I know," he said. "I would have gone back to St. Louis and found another position at another school and been competent and useful and organized and deeply, permanently alone," she said. "I think I knew that actually, sitting in that depot. I think some part of me already knew that I was leaving something I could not name." "You were leaving Kansas," he said. "I was leaving you," she said. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the armrest of the rocking chair, over where she held Thomas, and she turned her hand and held his back. The prairie evening moved around them. Somewhere in the barn a horse shifted. From inside the house came the sound of James and Clara in some negotiation about something that was probably about to require parental attention but had not gotten there yet. The sky to the west was turning colors that had no adequate names, deep pink and orange and a blue so intense it was almost physical. "Ralph," Augusta said. "Yes." "It was worth it," she said. "Everything, every part of it." He looked at her in that evening light, this woman who had come west with a trunk and a hope and found, after considerable difficulty, the real thing she had been looking for. And he thought about the 8 years he had spent on this land before she arrived, and how they had seemed complete at the time and how completely insufficient they seemed in retrospect. "Yes," he said, "every part of it." They sat on that porch as the evening moved over the Kansas prairie, and the stars began to show themselves in the east, Thomas asleep between their joined hands, and the life they had built together was present all around them in every detail, in the sound of the children inside, and the smell of the horses and the last warmth of the summer air, and the comfortable solidity of the house behind them that they had filled together. And neither of them said anything else for a long time, because there was nothing left to say that the silence did not already hold. Inside, James and Clara's negotiation reached its predictable conclusion, and Clara's voice, clear and decisive as her mother's, announced the outcome with authority. And Ralph and Augusta both turned at the same moment and looked through the window at their children, and then looked at each other with the expression of two people who are sharing something they could not possibly communicate to anyone outside the particular world they have built together. The years that followed were the years of a life fully and honestly lived. Thomas grew into himself with the particular combination of both parents that made him both thoughtful and physically capable, spending as much time with books as in the barn, and appearing to see no contradiction in this. James came into his inheritance of the land gradually and properly, learning everything his father had to teach, and at 18 was already a skilled cattleman in his own right with his mother's business sense, applied to the operations accounts with results that made Ralph observe, more than once, that his son was in some ways a better rancher than he was. James would always shake his head at this, because he knew what his father had built from nothing and had enormous respect for it, but the observation was not without truth. Clara, at 15, was teaching the younger children at the Caldwell School on Saturdays under Augusta's supervision, a formalized version of what she had been doing informally for years, and her mother watched her teach with the pride of a teacher who has produced something finer than herself. The world changed around them in the ways that worlds do. The frontier closed and became history while they were living in it. Kansas changed. The cattle drives that had defined Caldwell diminished as the railroad expanded and farming replaced ranching in many areas, and the Collier Ranch adapted, as it always had, with the attention and intelligence of its owners. They held their land. They managed their herd carefully. They remained solvent and stable through years that saw other operations fail. In 1898, Ralph Collier turned 52 years old, and Augusta threw him a dinner that brought together 30 people from around the county, neighbors and business associates and friends, accumulated over 15 years of being the kind of people that a community builds around. Tom Reeves came, older now and with less hair but with the same long-faced, dry-eyed assessment of everything, and he shook Ralph's hand and said, "You landed in the right place." And Ralph said, "Yes, I did," and looked across the room at Augusta, who was laughing at something Hartwell's wife had said with the full, unguarded quality of laughter that she had in this life, among these people, in this place that was entirely hers. She felt him looking and turned, and their eyes met across the room, and she raised her glass slightly in his direction, and he did the same, and the communication between them was entire and needed no translation. There were more years after that. Good years, difficult years, years that required everything they had and years that gave back more. Thomas grew and found himself and brought home a girl from a neighboring county, a serious, intelligent young woman named Ruth, who Augusta approved of immediately and instinctively for the quality of her attention and the directness of her manner. James married in 1903, a good marriage to a woman named Frances, who had come to Kansas from Ohio, and who had some of the same quality of determined self-directedness that Augusta had brought west 20 years earlier. Clara became a teacher in her own right, and eventually the principal of the Caldwell School, following a path that was entirely her own while being, in some ways, her mother's inheritance made concrete. Ralph and Augusta sat on the front porch of the house they had built together, in the evenings, as they had always done, watching the light change over the prairie that never stopped being beautiful to either of them. The rocking chairs were older now. The porch had been rebuilt twice. The barn had expanded and contracted with the operation's needs. The land had stayed. On a summer evening when Augusta was 60 years old and Ralph was 68, she sat with her hands in her lap watching the last of the sunset move across the western sky, and thought about every version of the woman she had been. The school teacher in St. Louis saving her money and answering letters. The woman on the stage coming west with her single trunk. The woman in the depot in Caldwell reading letters that told her the truth about her hidden past. The woman standing on this porch for the first time seeing what a real thing looked like. Ralph sat beside her, and his hand found hers without either of them directing it, the gesture of a lifetime of reaching for the same thing. "Are you happy?" he said. It was not a question he asked often. He was not a man who asked questions he was not prepared to hear answered honestly. She looked at the sky. "I am entirely happy," she said, in the way that requires having been entirely unhappy at some point, the kind that knows what it is and what it cost. He held her hand in the evening light. "Good," he said. The stars came out one by one over the Kansas prairie, as they had every evening for as long as either of them had been here. That vast, indifferent sky doing what it had always done, hanging over the land with its extravagant abundance of light, and below it the ranch and the house and the life inside it, the children grown and the grandchildren coming, the cattle in the pastures and the horses in the barn and the accounts in their proper order, and the school in Caldwell doing well. And two people on a porch who had found each other in the complicated, difficult, beautiful way that real things are always found, not easily and not without cost but truly, and with a depth that the years had only increased. The wind moved over the grass the way it always had, the way it would after them, the oldest and most honest thing in the territory, and Ralph Collier and Augusta Bishop Collier sat in it together and were entirely, completely at peace.